So there was, but as I say, Sally, who was his junior by I think about 15 years, outlived him, lived till about I think 1920, and she rewrote history. She made him into the paragon of a Southern gentleman, beloved of his troops, beloved of his superiors, and hardly ever made a mistake in battle. And if you tell that long enough, people will begin to believe it. Remember, Voltaire said, "History is just a bag of tricks we play on the dead." And LaSalle Pickett was certainly an example of that. So let us go to this gentleman, this incredibly facile and brilliant and determined man, Stephen Mallory. Had been a U.S. Senator, chairman of the Navy Committee, was, I'm proud to say, a county commissioner in Key West, the seat of Monroe County in Florida. And he left the U.S. Senate to offer his services to the Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis made him Secretary of the Navy. Of course, he had no Navy. But he soon created one. It rose to 500 ships at one point, and he was a man who made great strides with absolutely no resources. He selected good men, and he did as well as possible. And one of his goals, as I say, was to build ironclad rams and commerce cruisers and do it in Europe. And for that task, he selected our next gentleman here, James Dunwoody Bullock. He was a former commander, or he was a commander in the Confederate Navy. He was a former U.S. Navy officer, and he was assigned to Liverpool to begin acquiring, either through building or purchase, vessels to challenge the U.S. merchant fleet, and also to bring back across the Atlantic to help in the war on the coast. He was a superb organizer and sailor, and he also was Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. And if you know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, you know that he was a very naval president. He used the Navy, battleship diplomacy, used the Navy to kick the Germans out of Venezuela in 2002, used them to help facilitate the rebellion of the Panamanians against Colombia, and sent the Great White Fleet around the world. He really knew his Navy. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and had sent Dewey to Manila before the war started on his own hook. At any rate, this was one of his uncles. We'll meet another uncle later, and they both had a tremendous influence on Teddy, or TD as he was known in the family. James Bullock and his half-brother Irvin didn't come back to the U.S. after the Civil War, but they would sneak back to New York under assumed names just to visit young TD. And it was a great influence on his later fascination with the Navy. Now, this next ship is the Confederate States ship Alabama, the most famous of all the raiders. It took 64 prizes, burned most of them because the idea when you take a prize in these days was to get it into a prize court in your own home country so that the court could assess the value, and then the sailors and the officers would get a cut of what that value was. Well, because of the blockade, this was exceptionally difficult, so most of the time he would burn the vessels. He would, about every fourth or fifth one, he would bond them. That is, the captain would sign a document that said, if the South wins the war, we owe the Southern government this amount of money because you're letting our ship go. And then he would put all his prisoners from the other destroyed ships aboard and send it home. He would also recruit from the sailors, because sailors in the 19th century, they were less interested in the great causes of abolition or states' rights or pro-slavery or anything else. They were interested in money, and prize money was what they used to lure sailors of other nationalities to be the crews on these raiders. Most of the raiders, almost all the raiders that came out of Britain and out of France, the officers would come over from the south. And there were a lot of course, former U.S. Navy officers who were in this Confederate Navy. But the crew, they had to get around the Foreign Enlistment Act and the Neutrality Act of England. So they would send the ship out ostensibly as a merchant vessel. It would have no arms aboard, no ammunition, no war goods at all. It would have a British captain. It would have a Irish and British and German and Norwegian crew, as most of the crews were in those days. And then when they got off Madeira or the Canary Islands or the Azores, where they met a tender that had all their arms, all the southern officers aboard, all their munitions and war goods, then they would recruit the crew with dangling the prospect of prize money before them. And so most of the crews on these raiders were Irish and English, so, which could, sure, and it could cause some problems from time to time. But this ship, as I say, drove the American merchant fleet from the seas, almost single-handedly. It had some help from the Florida and the Georgia and the Sumter and a few of the other vessels, the Shenandoah, but 900 American merchant vessels changed their registration during the war and moved it to registration of other countries. And it took almost a century for the American merchant marine to recover from that. Now, this is an example of another side of Bullock's work. This is an ironclad ram, the Stonewall. And by this time, the British had tightened up their Neutrality Act. They were enforcing the letter of the law, and it was a poorly drafted act. So they started to seize or delay ships going out of Great Britain because of Adams, the ambassador or minister for the U.S. at the time, put a tremendous amount of pressure on them to do so. He had his own spy network to find which vessels were being prepared. And so Bullock decided he needed to switch venues or create another venue, so he went to France. Now, France wasn't governed quite the same way. This was Napoleon III, emperor, governing by whim, largely. And his aim was to get his nose under the Western Hemisphere tent by creating a monarchy, helping to create a monarchy in Mexico. And he saw the Civil War as a great opportunity because it would mean that instead of one united and fairly powerful nation, there would be two less powerful nations north of the Mexican border. And so he said, yes, come build ships. And the French builders, of course, were delighted because they would make a buck or two. So this was one of the ironclad rams that was built in France. But just about the time it was about to be launched, Vicksburg and Gettysburg happened, followed by Mobile Bay. These were all Union victories. And Napoleon began to see the handwriting on the wall. I don't think that the Confederacy is going to survive. I'll have to deal with the Union. Okay, you can't sell these ships to the Confederacy because that would violate French neutrality. You'll have to sell them to neutral nations. That precluded almost every vessel from reaching the Confederacy, except this one, because what the builder did was sell it to the Danes. Couldn't deliver it because the Danes were at war with the Prussians. But they needed a ram, they felt, so they purchased it. This was the Schleswig-Holstein question, and the two partially Danish provinces at the south end of Denmark ended up Prussian. The war was over. The Danes didn't need the ram anymore. It was called the Storkoder when they bought it, and so they sold it to the Confederates, and it became the Stonewall. But by this time, with all this back and forth, the war was almost over, and by the time it reached the shores of America, the war was over. So the captain took it into Havana, sold it for enough money to pay off his crew. The Spanish turned it over to the U.S., and they sold it to the Japanese, the Meiji Empire, and it was used in a battle against when the Meiji Restoration took place, the samurai revolted, formed their own Izo Republic, and in 1869, this vessel, as the Kotetsu, fought in the battle at Hakodate Bay. So it had a checkered past, but it's a good example. Now here's our friend the Shenandoah again. As I say, this ship was very, very modern. It left with only 25 crew. They had 25 officers aboard and 25 crew because that late in the war, the British sailors were no dummies, and they knew that prize money wasn't really in the offing. But as they cruised down the Atlantic, they picked up more and more crew members from the ships they took. You can either stay down in the hold chained, or you can volunteer to be part of the Confederate States Navy and, 3 hots and a cot. And so they got probably half a dozen to a dozen crewmen out of every ship they stopped. But this represented, for the strategy of the South, the naval strategy, the last forlorn hope. The reason for all this commerce raiding that we saw with the Alabama, and we'll see with the Shenandoah, was the hope on the part of the rebels that they would bring the North to the bargaining table because they were hurting them in the pocketbook. And they had a lot of supporters for that idea among the industrialists and the merchants in the North, who weren't particularly concerned about abolition, but they were concerned about the bottom line. And so throughout the war, that was the idea, with the commerce destroying, that finally we'll get the North to negotiate, and we'll negotiate a situation where there are two nations. The Confederacy will be allowed to exist. By the time October of '64 that this ship left England, Bullock knew that there wasn't much chance of that. But he had his duty to do, and there was one commercial target. They'd switched the registration for those 900 vessels. They weren't targets anymore because they were neutral vessels. But there was one huge set of vessels that was still available. It was the whaling fleet in the Pacific. So that is the target for the Confederate States ship Shenandoah. And you can see by this map here that it was the only circumnavigation by a Confederate vessel in the war. Started here from England. The double lines represent it wasn't commissioned yet. Then in Madeira it became a commissioned ship. They set out, they took 9 prizes and took crewmen off each one of them in the South Atlantic. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and they took a couple more prizes in the Indian Ocean, came to Melbourne. After they left Melbourne, they headed up to the Carolines, Ponape. It was called Ascension Island in those days. And there they burned 4 whalers, and the most important thing they did was take their whaling charts so they knew where the fleet was, the whaling fleet in the Bering Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk. Say that fast 3 times. And so that's where they headed.